Have you ever been isolated and afraid? Maybe you felt really just by yourself, felt like no one was around you. Maybe even felt like that way in your relationship with God. Today, I'm really excited to talk about week 3, Isolated and Afraid, in our series, Ghosted. Brings me to when I was going into the 4th grade. I had just moved from London, England with my family. I was 8 years old and I was going to a brand new school. I show up to this new school. I'm the only kid with an accent. I'm one of the few black students and I have no friends.
Just me, all alone.
When I showed up, I felt extremely isolated and afraid, not only because I looked different, sounded different, also because I just didn't know anybody. Sometimes finding yourself in a spot where you don't know anyone and you're the only one that looks the way you look or the only one that sounds the way you sound can lead to you being isolated and afraid. So I ended up praying to God that He would give me friends. I didn't really know how to pray at that young age, but I do remember praying, God, I just pray that I would meet a new friend. And would you know, pretty quickly I met some new friends. Not just one new friend, but actually quite a lot of new friends who thought my background was cool, who thought where I was from was cool, and accepted me for who I was. A lot of times when we ask God for help, we feel like we don't know whether or not He's gonna be willing or if He actually wants to give us the help that we need. There was a guy in the Bible in the Old Testament, his name was Habakkuk, and Habakkuk was a prophet, and he talked a lot to God about how he needed God's help. And not only did he need God's help, but Israel, country, the city, the town, the people needed his help. And in Habakkuk 1, we see Habakkuk's prayer to God, pleading for God's help. And he says this, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen? Violence is everywhere, a cry, but you don't come to save me. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed and there is no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted." Habakkuk was brutally honest when he prayed to God. Can I tell you today that when you feel isolated and afraid, you can be brutally honest when you're praying and when you're talking to God. God isn't afraid of your honesty. God isn't looking for you to say the perfect thing when you pray. A lot of times when we ask someone to pray, maybe it's at a dinner, maybe it's at a sporting event, maybe it's before a game, you often clap after they say their prayer and we're like, man, good prayer. And all of a sudden we start making people feel like prayer is a performance. In prayer, you can have good prayers and you can have bad prayers. But the reality is that God wants to just have a conversation with you so you don't have to feel the pressure of needing to pray a good prayer. And so 3 things when you feel isolated and afraid that I believe you can do to understand that God is truly with you. And it comes based on the response that God gives Habakkuk when Habakkuk prays his honest prayer. And it reads this in verse 5 of Habakkuk 1. The Lord replied, "Look around at the nations. Look and be amazed." First thing that I believe we can do when we feel isolated and afraid is to look around. Look around at nature. Look around at the trees, the mountains, the goats, the lions, all the amazing things that encompass this planet. Look around. What's around you which maybe you don't even recognize or realize is a miracle? What's around you that you don't even realize that if it wasn't for God, that thing wouldn't be? I know for me, one of the things which I'm starting to do more, I don't really like doing it, but I'm trying more to go on walks. You better believe when you go on walks, you start looking around at what's around you, your perspective begins to change. You start to realize that there's no way that this could be without a God, a creator in heaven. Look around and maybe you're like, there's no mountains around me, there's no goats around me, there's no lions around me. Well, take a trip to your local zoo and go and see the amazing gorillas, the amazing alligators, all the amazing animals that you might find at your local zoo.
Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages.
But I promise you, you'll understand that the stripes of a tiger didn't just end up on that tiger, but the stripes on a tiger ended up there because we have a creator in heaven who is a beautiful designer. Another thing that we see based on God's response to Habakkuk on what we can do in the midst of feeling isolated and afraid is that we can look to others. It says look around, so we can look around at nature and things that are around us, but we can also look around to others. Who's maybe some people in your life who you haven't actually taken a second to realize that they're for you, that they're with you, and that they love you. A lot of times we feel isolated and afraid, not because other people have pushed us away, but oftentimes we feel isolated and afraid because we have pushed others away. And we feel that others are the problem, but sometimes we are the problem. And we seek our own desires. We seek our own isolation. Sometimes it just takes us looking around and realizing who are the people that are knocking on our door, who are the people that are trying to find a way into our lives that God is asking us to let in. Maybe you're like, no, that's actually not the boat I'm in. Maybe you're in the boat where like I was. You're in a new space, you're at a new school, or maybe you're coming out of the pandemic and just things have been weird. You're just trying to figure out, man, how do I sit at the lunch table now? It's just not the same way as it was 4 years ago. Maybe for you, the thing that you need to do is pray to God that he would send the right people into your life so that you would feel surrounded and no longer feel alone. So look around, look at others. And lastly, I'm going to read a little bit more of this verse. Look at God. God says to Habakkuk to look around at the nations, look and be amazed. And he says this, he says, for I'm doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe, even if someone told you about it. The reason why God asks us to look at him is because he is doing something which if someone told us, we actually wouldn't even believe it. A lot of times in those moments where we feel isolated and afraid, we feel like God's not up to something. We feel like God has just left us alone, that God has isolated us, that God has ghosted us. But the reality is that God is doing something that if someone told you, you wouldn't even believe it. So today, do not be afraid. Do not be dismayed. Do not feel that you are left alone, that you are left behind, because God has actually gone before you and God is preparing a way so that as you walk in that way, you're going to be surprised at all the amazing things God is doing for you and God wants to do with you. So today, if you feel isolated and afraid, you're not alone. I've been there. I bet you there's so many people in your life who you look up to, but been there as well. You can take a stand today and know that, no, God is going to help me get to a place where I can be surrounded because he loves me so much. And I no longer have to do this on my own. Thanks so much for joining us today. Week 3 of Ghosted, Isolated, and Afraid. We'll see you next week.